It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum.
Well, hello and welcome to Islands at War, October 1943. Keith Bengelli here, of course, and I also have
Nick LaCure. Hi, Keith.
I have Nick with me. Hi, Nick. Okay, so lots to get through again. Very, very full episode ahead of us. In our last episode, I think, Nick, we were talking about the censor, Mr. Kurt Goettman.
Yeah, I think it was the last one? No, it was August. It was the August one. I'm going to lose track.
But he went away and now he's back.
He went away and now he's back. Well, let's just remind people, when we spoke about him last, there was a remarkable puff piece in the paper that I'd found saying how they were all going to miss him and whatever. And we were a little bit sceptical about whether we thought that was something that maybe he'd written or one of his colleagues had written.
That's
right. Yeah.
A glowing eulogy.
Oh, I did a bit more digging, you see, because I knew he was coming back in October because I knew he'd been a bit of a naughty boy. So I did a bit of digging and I found actually a couple of bits that I hadn't seen. Now, this article dates back to December 78 and appeared in the Scunthorpe Evening Telegraph. And you're probably thinking, why on earth is there an article about the German censor in Guernsey in the Scunthorpe Evening Telegraph some 33 years after?
Well, I was wondering. I wonder how you found it.
That was a bit of research in the British newspaper archive, which I've got access to. You'd be amazed what you find in there. So this was a piece by a chap called Mick Robins, who'd worked at the Star, the Guernsey Star newspaper in Guernsey during the occupation. Now, remember, we had this puff piece about how they were all going to miss him, and he was lovely. Yeah, they called him the Goat.
Why?
Well, I suspect that was probably from a corruption of his surname, but he was very avid fan of his blue pencil. Didn't give a monkeys about deadlines, apparently, and Mick Robins was not very happy when he had to go and do that. Now, we talked about one of the stand-ins for Goettman who was equally awkward, but there was another chap called Baumer but had married a Canadian and spent most of his life as a restaurateur in Canada and America. But he, unfortunately for him, he ended up back in Germany just before hostilities started, and let me tell you, he wasn't allowed to leave. You're not surprised, are you? Because we've gone over that ground so many times with poor unfortunates who've gone back for whatever reason and basically are then told that they can't leave. So this chap Baumer was seemingly much more popular. He was based in Jersey but used to visit Guernsey when Goettman, or the Goat, was not available. But apparently Goettman was a bit of a dandy, and they found out that he had lots of powder and things in his bathroom.
They had a sort of nickname for him, didn't they? That regarded him as what we would call in English as a sissy.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. They weren't very kind about him, shall we say? Anyway, no. That was Mr. Robins. They called him Mr. Wubbins, like the little bird, apparently.
All right.
Just reading this, it got called that by the German censor who just couldn't pronounce his name. Anyway, this article finishes up with Mick Robins saying, Goat was not all bad because one day he asked me how much the firm paid me. And I told him 13 shillings a week. And he said, 30 shillings? That's not too bad. Not 30, I replied, 13. 13, exclaimed, feigning exasperation and concern. That's disgraceful. That is very, very fighting this war to help people like you. Excuse the German, but that's how it's written. And he seized an opportunity to slip a sly piece of propaganda in while Goettman was not paying attention, shall we say. But this proved to be very fortuitous for Mr. Robins because the next day he got an increase to 30 bob.
Crumbs, more than double.
Yeah. So there we go.
If only he had something to spend it on.
Well, yeah, exactly. It might have helped with the black market.
Oh, I'm sure.
But Frank Fowler also talks about him in his book Silent War. He does say that Goettman did possess a very vital virtue, which was he was not a member of the Nazi Party and was fairly tolerant when dealing with local organisations and people who were responsible to him. he didn't force political jargon down your throat as long as you avoided discussing things that weren't allowed. So, I mean, there's two sides to it, I guess. But he did parrot Nazi cliches, in his propaganda that he wrote.
What sort of, was he army or was he sort of civilian with a military rank?
No, it's civilian. So he's a Sonderführer, which is like a low-level officer, but they're generally people who are a civilian expert in some field. So Goettman, from memory, had spent a lot of time in England.
So his ultimate boss was Goebbels.
Well, yeah, his ultimate boss was Goebbels. And frequently you see Goebbels' stuff in the papers being just quoted. Well, of course they've got to put that out. So, but Fuller had to work with him. So let's get to why he's back. I mean, he only disappeared at the end of August.
Can I just say, before you tell us about why he had to come back, is that I'm surprised that a non-party member was in such a position. You'd have thought they almost all had to be party members. That strikes me as odd.
Yeah, I mean, the Baumer wasn't a party member either, although that might be something to do with the fact he spent a lot of time in Canada and America before he was forced to work there. The other chap was Schmidt-Volkoff.
Yes.
Hopefully I pronounced that right, who was Goettman's successor. But Goettman hadn't got very far. He left at the end of August, having said goodbye to everybody, and he's back in October of 1943, got as far as Paris, not very close to the Eastern Front where he was supposed to be going, when he was brought back to the island, not as a Sonderführer, which means special leader, by the way, but as a common prisoner and criminal. And Frank Fuller found himself, when he fell foul of the German authorities, in the prison here in Guernsey, but also bumped into Goettman.
Yes,
wondering what on earth he was doing here.
He was incarcerated in Guernsey prison.
Yeah, he was held here for 6 months. Well, 6 months while they questioned him, and they had a lengthy list of charges, etc.
And the questioning, I think, was robust.
I would imagine so. I mean, you're probably wondering why they brought him back here and just didn't question him in Paris, but they did have a habit of doing that. The chap that killed the doctor in Sark, he was actually all the way in Berlin when they caught up with him and worked out that it was him, and he was brought back here. But yeah, he'd been lining his pockets, shall we say, a bit of light embezzlement, converting to his own use money that should have gone to Nazi party coffers, and Germany's winter relief funds. He'd been selling local furniture shops, civilian furniture that he'd acquired along the way. So from a premises that he lived in for a while at La Porte in St. Jacques before he moved house. And it was alleged that money derived from showing of German and pillaged British films was also converted to his own use. Only on his leaving of the island and the arrival of the red-hot Nazi replacement, they put the Gestapo onto him straight away, and his racket was laid bare. He had some other charges against him as well. He was allegedly found wearing a uniform that he wasn't entitled to wear, but also generally large-scale black market activities, selling in Paris gold at exorbitant prices that he got his hands on. So, yeah, he languished here for quite some time, for about 6 months, before they finally got around to actually putting him in front of her.
And I think he turned on his successor. I think he turned on Wolkoff as well, or Wolkoff. I think he one of the accounts here, when he was in Paris, apparently,
yeah, he said he
tried to
probably
successor in.
Probably in an effort to get himself out of trouble, maybe. Didn't work, so he got sentenced. He didn't get sentenced for 6 months, but he got 3 years after that, and then they shipped him off.
So where would he have served that sentence, in Paris? Or, I mean, did he ever end up on the Eastern Front?
I don't know. I don't know what happened to him. I presume he was in prison and therefore didn't end up on the Eastern Front. I have tried to find stuff to see what ultimately happened to him, but
he disappears into the mists of history.
Yeah, he does.
Well, he's a bit of a boy, that was for sure.
Well, he might as well have just hit every crime he possibly could have committed short of murder, by the looks of it.
That's why it's just really strange he got into this sort of position, non-party member, and like you say, he had a palette or a menu of crimes he indulged in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a relatively low level the Feldkommandantur civilian organization responsible for information and for the local, for the German police here and things like that.
But Guernsey, Channel Islands was still a bit of an apple in the German's eye. He's an intriguing character. Anyway, let's move on. We have now, talking of things Nazi, beginning to inveigle themselves into cultural affairs and church fairs here. I think that there was a banning of certain Jewish composers like Mendelssohn and such.
Yeah, there was, and we touched on that previously. And Ord's doing battle again with Goettmann's successor about programs full of Jewish things. He says he's demanding that he can't do that. He has a bit, kind of distracts him a little bit and starts talking about Stalin as well. And the German censor says, "Oh, Stalin's deceiving the Anglo-Americans." And it's terrible. A bit slightly random, but they carry on the conversation, and the Ord agrees basically. He'll modify his program a little bit to not mention who wrote the music.
Oh, so they could play Mendelssohn, they just weren't allowed to say it was by Mendelssohn. Yeah.
And they were also, there was a ban on dances at this point in time, and the local dean said, "We keep the music low, it'd be all right. We'll have a staff dance."
Right, as this is sort of flouting. Are these overt orders, or are they sort of just frowned upon here?
No, I think there were probably some orders kicking around. They were trying to stop association with. We talked about it in the September 43 episode. They were trying to stop association between civilians and Germans, so they were banning stuff right, left, and centre. Okay,
now we have another person that has returned to the Channel Islands. I think he was Graf von Schmettau. He was a colonel. He was well connected through marriage. I think he was nephew by marriage to General von Rundstedt.
He was.
And he returns. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so he'd been here initially, got replaced by General Müller in 1941. He was only a colonel then. He'd been based in Jersey initially, and then he came to Guernsey in September 1943. You remember we talked about him and that horrible accident. He stopped and got out of his car and didn't make any comment about the fact this poor chap had been hit by a drunken German on a bicycle. More of that later. So they had this. Louis Guillemot describes the fact that he went with the bailiff to pay a formal visit to the new German general. Now, when he says he went with the bailiff, there's quite Louis and one of his assistants have to get a taxi. No, so this is one of these gasogen taxis with a big gas bag and it has a sort of fan that gets the thing.
They're not that agile, are they?
No, they're not. But the bailiff goes in his own car, so they don't even all go together. I don't quite know how this works. They're met by von Schmettau's, and that's up at the Corbinery, and the visit. Louis remarks, people probably think it's a bit odd. Why did you go through with this? The polite, formal affair over tea. Which most people would go, well, why did you bother? It's a bit of a waste of time, isn't it? But he makes a very good point. The true purpose was to establish a personal connection so that they weren't strangers when they're dealing with him in future official dealings. Now, this is something I can really relate to because we've become a very online world and meetings happen over Zoom and Teams and all this kind of stuff. But if I'm meeting somebody that I'm doing business with for the first time, I like to meet them in person, unless there's a very good reason why we can't actually do that. And it's because you can't really build a relationship with them, or you get to understand body language, that sort of thing, when you're talking to them over Teams, and the conversation tends to be shorter, etc. So if you're meeting them for the first time, I think it's always nice to meet them in person. So I can relate to what Louis is saying here. Is look, we wanted to be front and center in front of this chap and get the measure of it, basically. What's he going to be like?
Yeah, but when he left here, he was a colonel, but he only went to Jersey. He didn't go.
No. He went somewhere else. I don't know where he'd.
Because that's quite a promotion to general.
Yeah. And he'd been based in Jersey initially when he was a colonel. I don't know where he disappeared off to in the meantime. Müller replaced him, and Müller was, by all accounts, a nasty piece of work. So, yeah. But as we've talked about briefly before, von Schmettau actually turned out to be a fairly reasonable chap, as reasonable as he could act without getting into trouble, and he does get into trouble later on.
Yeah, and I think he was one of those that returned after the war.
Yeah, he was invited. Yeah, he was invited back after the war. He came back in the 60s, wrote to the bailiff to inquire after the war to inquire how the civilian population were and stuff like that. So he wasn't all bad, and in fact, he ended up having to go later on. But that was because he was perceived to be being too nice. But so we talked about the Gasogene taxi. So after all of this, they've had their afternoon tea and pleasantries with von Schmettau. Louis gets back into his taxi along with his colleague. Jurat Lille has got into his car. He's gone. Bye-bye. So he's obviously got petrol, not Gasogene. And General and the ADC basically get so bored of waiting for the gas bag to fill up on the Gasogene taxi that they just go back inside. And eventually, Louis and his colleague in this taxi get to move off. It's a bit bizarre. It's a little bit Fawlty Towers.
Comedy of errors.
A bit Fawlty Towers-ish, something like that.
Okay, we have some more here from Louis. News from the outside. And Louis gets a job offer.
Yeah, Louis does get a job offer. And he's Jurat Lille, basically his boss, basically says, after the war, would you like the job of being assistant managing director of Lille Limited, which at the time was one of the biggest trading companies in Guernsey? He says, the whole idea being that by being assistant managing director for a couple of years, he could then take over from the chap that was actually acting as managing director.
And this would have meant basically leaving the civil service.
Yeah, and he's really torn about doing that as to whether he really wants to do that. And he writes in his diary about it a few times, but can I leave the people? I don't know. It's a great move, and it's kind of one of those things. It's like he'd be daft not to take it, but is what he's thinking from his own point of view. Can he actually do it? He's particularly, I can imagine, to leave public work for business, he says his conscience is not quite clear. He's really got a problem with, am I doing, I'm not doing the best for the island if I do that. People might think I'm doing it for my own financial interest. Don't know. But there's another interesting story that Louis tells us about as well, where the Germans, having stored all the cameras that had been confiscated in less than ideal condition, shall we say, then tried to pass them the responsibility off for storing them to the controlling committee, and Jurat Lille's having none of that. It's like, no, not happening. Sorry. They were clearly, because a lot of these cameras were, by all accounts, were ruined by the time you got to the end of the occupation, if you could even find it. Similar problem with the radios as well. And again, he's talking to Lille about, what might happen post-war. That's kind of how the whole job offer thing came up. That was that, really.
Okay, and Louis's wife, Queenie, had been in hospital, and I think this meant that Louis and some friends had to look after the little one, Josie.
Yeah.
And Josie is still with us. She hasn't been well lately, and I'm hoping to talk to her tomorrow. And it's really quite poignant, Nick, to go back in time and read about someone who's a baby.
And that we know. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you get the gist from, I think the underlying bit in Louis' diary, whilst Queenie is in hospitals, he actually realises quite what hard work it is looking after a baby. Him and his friend Dick, who do take turns, they basically take turns in looking after Josie. They're absolutely knackered.
Yeah.
They're sleeping in shifts because they're exhausted.
He was talking about how they made a great start on the housework and then downgraded it to a sort of just a dust and wet cloth.
Yeah, basically, and ending up just falling asleep in the lounge.
Yeah.
Basically. So, but I can't even begin to imagine what having an operation would have been like for Queenie at this point in time.
Well, no antibiotics, and your system is debilitated by the slow starvation, basically.
Well, just even the availability of anaesthetic was an issue. Anyway, so that's that, and it's a weird collection of stuff in Louis' diary for October 1943. Because the next thing he mentions is a power station,
a new power station,
and rather than being very efficient, as they're usually known for, they've been not very efficient because the Germans have decided that to build this new power station with the idea that the states of Guernsey should take over and run this newly finished power station. But they've built one that runs on coal and uses really outdated technology, it's called a suction gas plant, but with a small steam turbine. And it's just an uneconomic proposition for the long term, right from the get-go, because most people had given up on this tech 20 years before. But basically, there's no alternative because
that's it. There's just no alternative.
They haven't got any diesel oil available to keep the power on. So, but there's a lot of horse trading about that. But in the end, they have to take it over.
So, when you say takes, who's actually responsible? This is still a civilian piece of infrastructure.
Yeah, the Germans built it, but we ended up having to run it.
Do you know where it was situated?
Yeah, it was at the Boet.
Ah, that's right. It's in the Boet is a sort of outer suburbs of St. Peter.
Yeah, it was sort of where Admiral Park end of things, near the Co-op store.
Or fruit exporters.
Yeah, exactly.
It was. Yeah.
So it was down there, and it did get bombed a couple of times actually.
Deliberately, they deliberately targeted it.
I don't know if it was deliberate, but it did get bombed a couple of times. I don't think it actually got hit, or if it did, they didn't go off. But there was we mentioned it in the last episode. There was a pool created of seawater just over the seawall. You used to be able to see it. I haven't been to have a look recently to see if you can still see it, but that was basically water to cool the plant down. I'm not sure the merits of using seawater to cool down the power station, but hey, who knows?
Salt water and electrics.
I'm an engineer.
Okay. Now, another gentleman sort of wanders onto the stage. An interesting character, divisive character.
We've mentioned him a few times.
We have, but he's really come into focus here.
Yeah. It's a chap called Blakey Webster, and you might have gathered if you listened to the September 43 episode, he's a bit of a pain in the neck as far as the authorities are concerned. So he starts the occupation as being a grower, but then he becomes the chairman of the Star newspaper. And you'll remember when there was all this fuss over in August and September 43 about the children's allowance law and that all going through, and him kicking up a stink about it's not affordable, it's going to bankrupt the government, we can't possibly do this. He was stirring things up quite a bit, shall we say. That and a few other things as well. And Louis very politely writes in his diary that perhaps he's causing a bit of trouble, and if he actually knew what they were going through, trying to keep things on a vaguely even keel, then he would perhaps understand what other people were going through and maybe not be stirring things up a lot. But yeah, he was.
I mean, he's not pro-German.
No.
He's got the interest of the population at large, but he just seemed a bit sort of a self-promoter.
Yeah, he doesn't, and he doesn't seem to understand that those who are running the civil service and the controlling committee are doing their absolute damnedest, and the struggles that they're going through. Because why would he know? Because he's not in a position where he's attending any of his meetings or dealing with any of the stuff. He's only getting to see the stuff that comes through in the newspaper.
And he gets, I think we'll cover it in a little while later on in this episode, he gets involved in a couple of things, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just for the sake of getting involved, by the sounds of it. Daily life and restrictions, things are beginning to bite. There is alleged Gestapo. We've said they're not really Gestapo, they're just sort of Gestapo wannabes, but they're arresting youth for singing patriotic songs.
Yeah, so this was Frank Struban's cafe. Frank had obviously been deported by this stage anyway, but his cafe was still being run. And you may remember Mr. Machon, who made 2,000 of the badges with the king's head on a V for victory, who'd been charged and then sentenced to be sent away. So this was his going away party, which they all thought they'd have a bit of a sing-song, including the national anthem. So, yeah, so that caused a big fuss. Whole load of young people were arrested. To be fair, the Germans were going through a phase of rounding people up for just minor infractions anyway, even more so than normal in October 43.
And it's pretty dreary life at the moment here, isn't it? Hardly any meat, dreary vegetables, and the quality, is poor. And people are basically, the only thing to do is to go to bed early.
Yeah, because
there's just nothing to do.
Nothing to do. There's limited electric. The rationing of the electric, despite their new power station, it does get worse rather than better. We talked about the children's allowance scheme, and after initial success, which we reported and causing a lot of work for Ambrose Roban and co, they then found that there was a bit of a stigma attached to it, and it was seen as being something like the poor law, and so people stopped claiming it.
So this would have been essentially to put more disposable income into the pockets of poorer people, or people with more children, let's put it that way. And so people kicked against the traces a bit and didn't claim it because there was a bit of a social stigma attached. Yeah. Isn't it odd? Okay. What else have we got here? German activity here is still lots of fluctuating morale amongst the German troops, and sort of troops coming and going, guns being shipped off and coming back, and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, they're basically moving guns around, some between here and Jersey, some between here and France. There's shells being shipped off to France. They're pulling up some of the railway lines. Well, as we discussed in the September 43 episode, they're fairly well on with building stuff. They're reducing the number of workers they got here. They're shipping them off because they want to use them elsewhere on reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, because they're absolutely terrified that the Allies are going to invade France at some point very soon. It's difficult because people are trying to keep track in their diaries. You see it frequently. They're trying to keep track of how many have come and how many have gone. And it's really difficult, and what the role of those that have come in to replace the others are. So it's a bit of a difficult one. Another bit of the crackdown that Ambrose Roban notes is the newspaper editor Gartel of the Guernsey Press. He gets suspended by the Germans because a Red Cross, a message from the King and Queen, he prints it in the paper. And now the Red Cross message, I just find this amazing that it got this far anyway. But you remember we said that in the last episode that the people had been allowed to have a copy of it, but not the original. And it was a golden wedding anniversary.
That's right. That's the reason why they got in touch with it.
Yeah. But he decides he's going to print it in the press in October and promptly gets suspended. There's more reports from returning internees. We talked about them as well in September, that the people were coming back, about the horrible conditions that there were in Germany, etc. as well. But the rough weather is hampering travel, and that they've got inadequate clothing, etc.
And we're hearing about German soldiers, German military coming back and talking about conditions in Germany, because the war isn't going well, is it? The Allies are advancing. Naples has fallen. Russian guns, ironically, cover Kyiv, which is what they want to do again, how history repeats. And the BBC say that the Russians have crossed the river Dnieper, which was a big factor in the rising morale of the Allies. And then the United States Air Force is beginning their daylight raids. Yeah,
they're bombing the living daylights out of places like Stuttgart, and there's been a few strategic gains like the Azores as well. And the Germans are obviously, Ord notes that, whilst he's obviously aware of this stuff because he's listening to the BBC.
Yeah.
But the German in their propaganda, etc., are conveniently ignoring all of this stuff and just having, Ord says, lurid anti-Jewish propaganda.
Well, they're mixing up with anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik propaganda as well.
Yeah, exactly. Just for good measure, they're getting the communists involved as well. Now, Ord also notes that guns is being circulated. The Guernsey Underground News Service.
This is, as sums it up, illegal.
News being transcribed. Now, I do wonder, because Ord talks about taking down the news. I just wonder if he ever had any... I've not seen anything saying that he had any involvement with them, but he does talk about taking down the news on the BBC. Now, whether that's just for his own diary purposes or something else, but he does make an interesting comment that the risks of such a venture merit more than most DSOs. So he thinks it's worth more than a DSO, the risk that these people are taking in doing that.
All didn't have a radio. You used to go to somebody to listen.
Yeah, he used to go to the neighbours to go listen.
So what do we think? He was copying all this down.
Additionally, he talks about transcribing it. So I don't know if he's been passing it on to somebody else. And I don't know. The guys from Guns were definitely transcribing it themselves anyway. I just wondered because I saw, this reference to it and the fact that he was transcribing it. And then he starts talking about the guys from the Guernsey Underground News Service, although he doesn't mention them by name at the time.
Okay. He also, Reverend Ord, talks about reading about a French governess recalling her. I think he meets her in hospital. Is that right? He sees her in hospital?
Yeah, I think it is.
Meets this French governess who was recalling her days in Russia as a governess, and she was there when the Bolsheviks took over. Now, it's absolutely incredible coincidence because last week I was interviewing a lady whose mother was instrumental in looking after this lady in the war.
She was nearly 90.
Yes, that's right. And her name was Madame Serre, S-E-R-R-E, and I have a picture here. I know you can't see it, but this is a picture of her on her 87th birthday at La Fontanelles. And I'm talking to a lady that's mother was attached to or did know German officers. This is a developing piece of research which we'll get to in due course. But yeah, quite odd that, again, having spoken to someone whose mother knew the person we're talking about, it brings it really quite close to home.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also talk as well, Reinhold is worried. More and more Germans, as they're coming back from leave, either weren't able to get to Germany because of problems and they had to turn around and come back, or they did get there and they saw what happened. Now, Reinhold had been on leave.
This is Ord's German acquaintance who's very anti-regime, isn't it?
Yeah. Reinhold had been on leave the month before, but he calls on Ord and he's talking to him about refugees moving into villages, the worst potato crop for a long time, and they're fearing raids on their hometowns.
So these are refugees that are starting to come
out of the cities.
Yeah, out of German cities into the countryside.
Yeah,
looking for food basically, and to get away from the bombing.
Yeah, basically, and to get away from the bombing. And Reinhold says, "Well, it's just retribution, isn't it?"
Yeah.
They're also worried about what happens if the Russians get into Germany because they're being realistic at this point, unlike the regime.
Yeah, okay. The continuation, of course, of this shabbiness is to be seen around. All the streets are dirty, the houses are shabby, people are undernourished, and one forgets that in this day it's so easy to get razor blades and soap and deodorant and things like that. But really, people must have had terrible trouble with hygiene. It makes you wonder just about odours and things, but tough time. And of course, there's still some time to go before liberation.
Well,
what else have we got here? We got some really.
If you speak to some people, they say that this was a pretty bad time. Whilst 44 was obviously the worst, some of them say, this was almost as bad as the winter of 44 and into 45. At least they got into. At the end of 44, they started getting Red Cross packages, etc.
There's the other thing that sticks out is that rubber boots limited to fishermen and farm workers. I think Wellington boots, really.
And they were 55 shillings, or whatever that happens. I'm not sure what that is.
The other thing is, there's so much, some commodities being such and such on the black market, because stockings, 23 shillings plus tax. But if you're at the black market, does tax get paid?
Well, no, I presume this is from the shop.
Yeah.
I don't imagine for 1 second anybody's declaring tax on their black market dealings. But he also talks about useless excavations that just ruin prime land because the Germans start digging stuff up and then go, oh, actually, no, changed their mind.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been absolutely soul-destroying to go to St. Peter Port because there's just nothing there. I mean, and just the heartbreaking to think of what it was like. Okay, here we got other elements of disobedience and things, and the underground press has printed Churchill's speech.
Yep, so that's Guns. They printed the entire speech that Churchill made, which I think was partly what made Ord refer to DSOs. Yeah, and again, Ord talks about Gartrell being dismissed from the and the Guernsey press because he apparently misunderstood communication about whether he was allowed to print that Red Cross letter or not. There's talk about raids again for looking for radios. There's a lot of that going on because they're terrified. They don't want people hearing the news. And Ord recounts a story about one very ingenious fellow who, on being warned by his wife that the Germans were coming up the path, went and sat on a commode where he put his radio and made lots of noises and pretended to have dysentery, which, unsurprisingly, that put the Germans off.
Yeah, I bet
They didn't want to look in the commode. Funny that.
Yeah.
But he also talks about some of the Russian slave workers are spilling potatoes deliberately so that civilians can pick them up, which is not something I'd come across before. But
No, I've never heard of that. You'd have thought, you'd have thought the Russians would have kept them for themselves. Yeah, well, like I say, I haven't seen that anywhere else. And the other thing is, Ord and his wife culled their library, and he took 1,000 books down to a bookshop.
He did.
And sold nearly all of them. And he said he was so surprised because he was an academic, and some of these, I think, were theological books on theology and quite metaphysical. And he said people were buying nearly everything. And he said he just couldn't believe that some of his books were so flew off the shelves.
Even very young people were really, surprising as far as that goes.
People were just so bored they'll sort of read anything. I
mean, he's busy conducting quite a few funerals, as we've talked about before, and he also mentions that a chap who's an old carter on a horse and cart, as he's sort of loitering, waiting for people for the funeral and whatever, the old carter leans down to him and says, "Berlin last night, so didn't half give him socks."
Yeah. Okay, now we got this chap who's been killed by a Luftwaffe.
Yeah, we talked about that last month, but Ord talks about it a bit more because he's still very angry about it.
He talks about road hogs.
Yeah, and he's almost been run over again. But the Germans are basically not very good at driving. You've got to remember they weren't a very mechanised country, and certainly not a very mechanised armed forces. And certainly at the start of the war, and not very many people owned cars, so they weren't necessarily the best of drivers. They're driving on they were initially driving on the other side of the road. They're not by this point because they've changed it, but they just drive really badly. And part of it, I do wonder as well, if potentially is down to maintenance because they can't get the bits and whatever, because, of course, they're using a lot of trucks and cars that have been
dodgy brake.
Yeah, and if you haven't got the bits to fix them, is that causing problems as well? But there's a German that bullies a small child as well. Ord talks about that. This very small girl says something that she thinks is funny. And the German basically grabs her and carts her off to go and see her mother. And he's basically been bullying her. Lots of Georgians and Italians have turned up. The Italians mostly being what get described as, I think Lesotho calls them in-betweeners. So they don't want to fight for Italy. They don't want to fight for Germany, but they don't fancy being a PO. So they'll instead volunteer to work for the Germans.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Not really sure that I've heard about the Germans coming in the same way as the Georgians. I mean, the Georgians were a nasty bunch. I mean, I think my family had some dealings with them, and they were quite brutal, whereas I think the Italians were more sort of, let's just keep out of the way. But the Georgians were under no illusions. If and when the Germans fold, the Georgians are really for it, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They were quite desperate, and we'll see. 1944, they got involved in some quite nasty situations once the Red Cross parcels started to arrive.
Yeah, and there's lots of arbitrary enforcement of petty rules and things like that going on, which upset people as well.
Okay. Overall, Nick, is there any optimism at all? Are people have they got anything to look forward to?
I think they are buoyed up a bit by Churchill's speeches and things like that, and occasionally getting Red Cross messages. I think the fact they know from illicit listening to the BBC or from news sheets or just from rumours going around that maybe there's finally a crack in the German government and that they're heading for a military disaster, which is a fairly good assessment of the situation as it stands by the time we've got to October 1943. Equally, that's sort of tempered a bit by how many more months of this have we got? Well, the answer's quite a few.
Yeah, and we've seen some mention of this Dr. Albrecht, who I've heard of. Tell us, he's writing a book on social conditions in Guernsey.
Yeah.
This is a book, not a report.
No, it's a book.
Who on earth could this appeal to?
Who knows? I'm sure they could have found something better for him to be doing, to be honest. But I don't know.
I mean, who sort of said, why don't you go to Guernsey or the Channel Islands and write a book? I mean, it's just an odd thing to contemplate.
It'll be done through the Feld Commandant or so. I don't know. They wrote a tourist guide to the Channel Islands, for God's sake, which I saw a copy of that actually the other day for sale. Well, I don't know how much it went for. It was on an auction site in the UK. I didn't feel inclined to bid because I saw how much they wanted as a reserve on it, and I thought, I don't think so. Then we get another interesting thing. Ralph Moller's taken a press cutting in Jersey from the Jersey Evening Post about Oberleutnant Zepanik, who had spent 3 years to the very day on which he arrived in Jersey between that and being buried in a soldier's grave in the military cemetery at St. Brelard in Jersey. And the paper reports about the weather was gloriously fine and the military service was an impressive one. Representatives of the various branches of the German army and the services attached to it being present with the guard of honour escorting the body, etc. Now, this chap had done 3 years in the island and he'd been basically in charge of arrangements for occupying the leisure of soldiers. He'd organised cinema performances there and been involved in the German orchestra and an island choir for the troops, etc. It doesn't really sound like a frontline chap, but he was particularly keen on the task of organising performances, the article goes on to say, and his office was in the Metropole Hotel, and that brought him into lots of contact with civilian population. He had a very good knowledge of English, and guess where he'd lived before the war?
In England.
America.
Oh, America.
America. So he had a fairly good relationship with the locals. So he was probably carrying out a very similar role to Goettman, but in Jersey. Now, I picked this up because I just thought it was unusual that his body was brought back to the island to be buried, because he wasn't killed in the island. He died somewhere else and his body was brought back.
So where was this, in France?
I presume it must have been France, yeah. But his body was brought back to the island. So
was it moved again after the war? Was he still at rest at St. Brelard?
I don't know, to be honest. That's not something I've looked at. But it also prompted something quite interesting. Now, we've talked about the Germans giving full military honours to any Allied servicemen that were buried here, if they were washed up on the beaches or, they ended up here, an aircraft had been shot down or whatever. But after this chap's funeral, the next month, there's a letter from Lieutenant Colonel West, who's a very elderly gentleman in Jersey, and he's obviously been getting a bit of stick because he'd actually attended the funeral for this chap. And he'd written into the Jersey Evening Post saying, "It's come to my knowledge that a section of the Jersey population has seen fit to question the loyalty of my wife and myself as British subjects, finally substantiating their criticisms on the fact that I recently attended the funeral of the late Oberleutnant." And so he basically has written in to say, I just want you to know my loyalties are in no way
compromised by knowing this chap. Yeah.
He says, look, I was gazetted as a second lieutenant in 1899 into a famous Highland regiment and was on active service throughout the Boer War and Great War, and on my retirement in 1920 voluntarily joined the reserve of regular officers, in which I remained until over age. As I say, this guy was getting on a bit. And, and his wife had done voluntary work at Red Cross hospitals during the First World War and had been acting commandant of the British Army and Navy League Club from early 1940 until she was obliged to leave France. So he's basically saying, look, leave off. The Germans afford this treatment to our service personnel that are being buried. And I knew this chap quite well. So, and he wasn't a nasty piece of work or anything like that, and I felt I should attend. But don't be calling me out on it. I mean, he gets a bit angry towards the end. He says, personally, I consider it despicable the attitude of a certain section of the civilian population who, in the name of patriotism, slander and criticise fellow citizens without any proper knowledge of the circumstances or grounds which govern their actions.
No change there then, really. So we don't know how the Oberleutnant was killed then?
No, I don't. I will have another look.
Yeah.
I couldn't find anything.
The only thing I could think of is possibly an air raid in France and they brought his body back.
Or maybe, I don't know, if he was on his way to France on a boat and it was one of the ones that got attacked.
Right, yes, of course. Right, now, Lesotho, our friend in Jersey. He's back. Another one who's back.
We've not heard from him for a while because he's been tipped off. If you've listened to earlier episodes, our friend Lesotho was an average radio listener. He had not one, not two, but 3 radios hidden in various different places, and along with keeping detailed notes about what was going on. And he had been tipped off that he might need to do something about this because they were about to come after him. Now, looking at it, it seems that the chap that tipped him off is a chap called Bartlett, who was a radio repairman and radio dealer. Very handy person for our friend Lesotho with his 3 radios to know. But this chap, through the course of his work, had cause to be at Victoria College, which the Germans were using as an administration place fairly often. And Bartlett got wind of the fact that Lesotho was going to be raided. And so he didn't feel it was wise to keep everything there. But he talks about it's fairly widely known that he's got one radio, but he keeps it rather closer to his chest about others. He's taken quite a few risks. Bartlett, anyway, has warned him that this might be the case. Bartlett's having to repair radios for the Germans. He's got no choice. So that's how come he's coming and going up there. Bartlett also is very handy for him because when he feels it's safe to start listening to the radio again, Bartlett's able to lend him one. He can get his other radios up and running again. Yeah,
so this Bartlett then, he fixing radios for the Germans. He must be fixing civilian radios for the Germans, not military radios. They've got their own people.
Yeah, it'll be the civilian ones that they've nicked off of everybody. So yeah, I just thought that was quite interesting. But Lesotho's trying to have a bit of a catch up on what's going on. In terms of trying to remember what's happened since he last wrote his diary. He's talking about there was a big fire on Route Orange, so that burnt down a whole load of huts and workshops and stores. Because of the slave labourers being taken away, they were interviewing young men to try and get them to work for them. Lesotho also talks about the fact there's fewer flak batteries now than there were, and they're a bit more economical with their ammunition, shall we say. Although he does say occasionally they just chuck up everything that they've got in a vague hope they might actually hit something. He talks about seeing the US Air Force going over, and also the sad case of a US airman being washed up. And then he finishes up that towards the end of the month, some 200 Italian soldiers arrived on the 23rd of October, complete with their band, and at least one more batch had come since. Yeah, he calls these the betwixt and betweens who won't fight for Jerry and don't mind working for him in preference to being taken prisoner, although it would appear. Now, I recall that they have armbands. If the Germans think that they're probably on their side, then they give them an armband. And if they think they're a bit dodgy, then don't have an armband and they're not allowed access to a weapon.
Oh, so they did some sort of filtering of loyalties there.
Yeah.
I wonder whether they did that. That's interesting.
Yeah. I think the armband was yellow from memory.
Yeah. And were there Italians in Jersey and Guernsey?
Yes, there were.
Okay.
Although I think there were more of them in Jersey than there were here. Yeah. We had more Georgians.
Well, October 1943, my father on the 3rd of October 1943 was 9. I still have his 9th birthday card. And I think it's pretty much all he had for his birthday. Yeah,
there were what Ord talks about in his diary about wooden toys being made, toys being recycled. There's not a lot else they can do, is there?
No,
it's fairly miserable.
It was. I mean, Father used to talk about going to bed as soon as you had your meagre meal. just went to bed.
Yeah,
and that was difficult sometimes because it was still light till quite late.
Yeah, and Lesotho talks about the fact, you haven't had your 4 ounces of meat every week that you're supposed to get. It doesn't turn up a lot of the time, but 4 ounces is just tiny, and that's to last you a week. And
it's not as if it's fillet steak either.
No, exactly. I guess you have that with one meal, or maybe make it last over 2.
Yeah.
And then it's back to the vegetables for the rest of the week.
Yeah, I just don't know how my grandmother managed to cope, because she would have had my father, my aunt as small children, and then she had her mother and father-in-law to look after. Quite. I
meant to mention something in the last episode, and it completely slipped my mind. A friend of the show, Kerry, he did a video when he was here for the 80th Liberation, and I said I would mention it because he's finished the video, and it is available on YouTube. You can catch it if you look up Backyard Battlefields or bung in Guernsey Liberation Day 80. You will see some cracking footage. He got loads of footage of the aircraft that were here up at the airport, the parade, the military parade in the morning, and the cavalcade and everything. So it's well worth 8 minutes of your time just to have a look at that and see what went on earlier on in the year. It's well worth a look. It just summarises what happened.
Yeah, and we thank you for supporting this podcast. And if you want to get hold of either Nick and myself, you can get hold of us occupied@gnetradio.com. We're on course to record Christmas 1943, December 1943, and Christmas 1943, of course. Are we going to put that out on Christmas Day?
Yeah, we might have to put out a couple of episodes next to each other to be able to achieve that, but I'm sure we can.
Yeah, okay. And like I say, thank you ever so much for your continued support. And we will go into 2026 with 1944 as our focus, and then towards the end of the year will be 1945, of course.
Yes. Yeah, indeed.
We've been doing this now for nearly 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years in February.
2 years in February. From how time flies, it really has amazed us, the amount of support that we've received. I think we've just been completely gobsmacked by it.
Yeah, no, it's amazing the amount of people that listen and interact with us on social media or via the emails as well. So it's great to hear from everybody.
Okay, I think it's time to say goodbye.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back with you very soon with November 1943. So it's goodbye from Keith, and it's
goodbye from Nick. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes, and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone, left on a ship 'cause they knew